almost any innovative idea in a lot of ways at its early inception, you could say, that a lot of things initially sound like a silly or dumb, or you could easily critique them or find reasons why they're not going to be true or that's not right. The consensus says X, and is the consensus right? And so
That's so cool. I put Ryan Smerek in Google, and the second thing in the drop down is Ryan.Smerek basketball player.
See, that's an interesting thing. I've heard Adam Grant talk about this, like the identity of being a professor, like, or an academic versus being a writer. Like once you start writing popular books, you're actually even if you're an academic and that's like your core of your thing, you're interacting with many more people as a writer, in theory.
Yeah, psychology. Oh, he has some Psychology Today articles. I didn't really know that.
Yeah, and actually he mentioned one that I wanted to link, and it might be a Psychology Today post about.
That's cool.
It might be about sense making. I want to find that sense making thing. Maybe we'll message him. All right, so who do we have on the podcast today?
A really cool basketball player,
ex-professor.
Yes. Yeah, ex-basketball player, professor, writer, and a researcher,
author of a brand spanking new book that I'm holding up called Speaking Up at Work, Leading Change as an Independent Thinker, written by the one, the only
Ryan E. Smerek.
Yes, PhD. Ryan was our professor at Northwestern. Personally, he was my capstone or thesis advisor. I think we had a really great time. I'm excited for this one because we just finished having a conversation with him, and I thought there was some really awesome topics that we touched on. I could talk to Ryan for hours.
Good. I could too. He is good times, and his sense of humor. I appreciate his sense of humor as well.
Absolutely.
And his knowledge, his vast knowledge. He probably
a wealth of knowledge.
Probably mentions like 10 books. Like we have some links to post.
I can't guarantee that we're going to post a link to every book. I think that nowadays, if someone hears the title of a book, they could take it and type it into Google and pretty easily find it. But we will try to link to some things like his.
There's some really good ones in there. But yeah, definitely tune in. And he mentions some really great books and thinkers also that have shaped his own thinking.
Yeah, we touch on, we obviously talk a lot about his new book, Speaking Up at Work. Yeah. We talk about his previous book, which is about organizational learning. We talk about his life and his upbringing, and I thought it was really cool.
Yeah, it was.
All right.
It was great. All right, so enjoy this conversation with Ryan Smerek. Ryan Smerek, Dr. Ryan Smerek. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So Ryan, Tuli and I had the great pleasure in being in a few of your classes. You are an instructor, a professor at Northwestern, MS, the Masters of Science in Learning and Organizational Change. And I remember before meeting you in person being like, I bet he'd be real fun to hang out with. Like he just seems
sure.
And like you have this cool, dry sense of humor that I was like, he's really funny. I don't know what all the laughs are, but
I try.
Those are some of my favorite memories.
It is interesting though, I'll say, to meet someone, and take their class for a while and meet someone only virtually, and then finally you get to meet them in person.
Yeah, I have my jokes about height. So
yes.
I have started out foundations. I'm saying I'm 6'9", in case you're wondering, because it is, when I travel too, it's like, it's not salient. My height is not salient when I'm around people that I know, obviously. And then when you travel or you see new people, it's like there's a strong curiosity. People really want to know. They want to know like the number.
So I'm curious about two things. Like, first of all, when I met you, I did not know you were going to be 6'9", and my introduction, like, I was like, whoa, there's no way to tell on a computer. So first of all, like, what is that like going through life being 6'9"? And also, what happens when you meet someone that's taller than you or your height? Is that like, wow, we understand something about each other that's like a deep thing that maybe others around us kind of don't get?
A little bit, yeah. Sometimes there's an awkward kind of like look, like, oh, he's I rarely see somebody that is taller than me, but it's one of those things that's not really salient. It's sort of like a fish in water.
Yeah.
Until like if I see a picture of me, like, wait, who's that guy? Oh, wait, that's me. Then it becomes kind of salient then. So, but yeah, it's just it's my wife will occasionally buy me sort of funny T-shirts, that say something, Wookiee of the Year, 1977,
Right.
things like that, and I'm like, I never wear them because like I get enough attention as it is. I don't need a T-shirt to also add to get more attention. Like I'm just fine. If I could just kind of fade into the world. So
that makes sense.
Fair enough.
That makes sense. Well, you mentioned that you played basketball. Can you maybe just start us off by telling us a little bit more about your background and your upbringing and how you got to be a professor of organizational studies, or whatever you might call it, of learning and organizational change, or organizational behavior, etc.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of early on. I saw the question in advance, and I did. It was, when I was a senior in college, I read In Search of Excellence. That book came out in 1984 or so, and just was kind of fascinated by that. People studying organizations and how they work, how they can be improved. And so I think it started kind of early on from that. But I've always had just kind of a educational background. My dad's was a math professor, and so I was kind of have that background, and so it was just kind of being fascinated by the science of organizations. I say science, but just the exploration of business and management, and so it started kind of early on, with In Search of Excellence, and then my first job out of college was at a consulting firm, and it was kind of a small boutique firm in Boston. It was in financial services, and they had a leadership part as well. But I ended up sort of, I ended up taking an organizational behavior class at the Harvard Extension School right away. I just was kind of, always kind of learn. I've just been, always kind of an avid reader and trying to understand the world. So, it just kind of snowballs from there. You just kind of keep learning more and more. And I did a master's part-time when I was working at the Kennedy School of Government, did a master's in leadership development, higher education, organizational behavior, and love the coursework, just kind of the fascinated by all the different ideas, and then just kind of continued that on with a doctoral work. So it's one of those things that just kind of snowballs. So you just kind of keep learning more, and just kind of follow your curiosities.
That's cool.
Awesome.
That's cool. What did you study in for undergrad? That I don't remember.
It was economics. So, but I probably have been more interested in economics since I don't know that it was necessarily as undergraduate as economics is taught in undergrad. Is not. It can be pretty theoretical, and with supply and demand curves and macroeconomic trends. But I think economics can be fascinating. If I follow kind of Russ Roberts. I've listened to his podcast he's an economist, and he has 900 podcasts. I've listened to him for 10 years.
Wow.
So it can be, economics can be a fascinating lens on the world. I don't know. It didn't fascinate me, I think, when I was an undergrad, though.
Yeah. And was your basketball? That was college. That was high school. That was all from college, a very young age.
Yeah. I played basketball at Dartmouth, and it was quite a privilege to play at Division I athletics. So it was a great way to see, get to travel around, see other schools, and as well as have that community, the group of friends right away. So still friends with my teammates. So it was a great experience to have.
Any early lessons on organizations or organizational culture from your athlete days, or leadership?
Yeah. I one thing that I've always been puzzled with, I haven't quite, that Scott Snook, he's a professor at Harvard Business School, professor of leadership, and he has 2 case studies on Bobby Knight and Coach K. And he looks at their leadership, which from the outside they look like diametrically, they look very different as leaders, but they have almost the same records, like both like 900 wins, same number of national championships, but yet they're quite different. At least the public persona is quite different. And so I had a college coach that was probably a little bit more towards the Bobby Knight side. And I don't know that I necessarily really respond well to that. Like I would respond more to the Coach K. So I think there are lessons in kind of the situational leadership. And some people really need that sort of yelling, or they need that that helps them. For me, it does really kind of does the reverse. I think it just makes you more fearful of making mistakes rather than playing loose and free. And so I think there's lessons there for situational leadership. What kind of leadership for a certain type of personality individual? I think there's lessons there. Because some, I like Bobby Knight would be like I would never, just from his outside persona, I would never want to go play for him. But I hear other people say, "Oh yeah, I want to play for a coach like Bobby Knight," and that's sort of like it's so different. They sort of sense they need that. They need that that I don't know, relatively harsh accountability.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. Like when I was looking into the like abusive cultures and stuff like that, and abusive management, it turns out that like you can't really talk about abusive management in in the military, or really anywhere where there's like in boot camp, or anywhere where there's an expectation that that's what you're getting into. So I could see, like, if you know that you're getting a Bobby Knight and you're ready for it and that's what you want, then, hey, all the power to you, I guess. Again, I can't see it working for me either. But hey, for some people that seems to be something. Maybe for Alma it would work. I don't know.
Oh yes, sign me up. Kidding. No, I would. Yeah. Nope. No.
Yeah.
So do you play?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ryan, do you still play basketball, like pickup games?
Not really. No, not just with my two sons. They like to play. They've gotten into the NBA and they like to play. So they're 11 and 12. So I will play with them one-on-one and games of horse and pig and stuff like that.
Awesome. Do you miss it?
I think for a certain time, I think throughout being part of that team and having that structure in your life was really nice.
Yeah.
And that kind of cycle of that every March too, when the March Madness is there and that it's all in the air. I think I do kind of miss it during that period of time. So, but not on a regular basis, but now I'm more, they can go to my kids' games and do that. It's exciting.
Awesome. So you went and you did a PhD at the University of Michigan, and you did this really what I think is a really, really cool dissertation, where you interviewed, was it 18 different university presidents? And can you maybe tell us a little bit about that and that experience? Like what were you looking at? What were you studying? And,
sure.
And what'd you find?
Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by the experience of being a college president that was an outsider to the organization, and they were, in charge from day one, but you didn't, organizations, universities are so complex, and how are they going to know? You don't know the names of buildings or people, and yet you're kind of in charge on that first day. And it was somewhat inspired by Rakesh Khurana at Harvard Business School. In my master's program, I had read a book called In Search of a Corporate Savior, CEO Search and Searching for a Corporate Savior. It was about the corporate world. And I kind of thought, is that same phenomena happening in some way with college presidents, that most colleges would be better to promote someone internally in some way? And so that was sort of the hypothesis.
Real quick about the book about In Search of a Corporate Savior. Is the thesis kind of what the main point, kind of like what it alludes to in the title, about like we have an issue that we're looking for saviors? Or could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the book came out in maybe 2002, 2003. It was a little bit after the sort of dot-com bust, and it kind of looked at, he's a sociologist, and sociology to a certain degree would think that mostly leadership is sort of overestimated, and success is sort of over attributed to leaders. And leaders don't make that much difference, and we just kind of say that they're making this huge difference. And so that book, it's a good sociological analysis of I think they're, like the AT&T CEO and some of the companies that had looked for this outsider CEO to come in and turn around the company, and it didn't work out. Obviously, you can find a lot of examples like that. And so that was one of the inspirations for my dissertation, was kind of looking at a similar phenomenon in higher ed institutions, as well as I had taken 2 classes from Carl Weick, as I mentioned, and studied sense making and that process of trying to understand all his work. And he's a really unique thinker. And so I applied sense making.
What is sense making?
Yes.
What is sense making?
What is sense making?
Yes.
It's really kind of it's a philosophical approach to studying organizations. You look at different. It's somewhat from the cognitive school. I have a whole post on it, but it draws through a tradition of psychology and philosophy to study, using mostly qualitative methods to see how people are kind of trying to, he uses make sense, rather than one way to help understand it is sense making as compared to decision making. So decision making is, you're sort of saying from a sense making lens, is sort of looking at just one point in time and not looking at the whole scope of over a longer period of time. And decision making kind of just narrowly focuses on one point and misses the bigger process of everything that led up to it. And so that's probably the simplest way to do it. But he has a whole 1995 book called Sense Making in Organizations that I used.
Amazing. We can link to that post of yours in the show's notes. Which would be great. So yeah, so you're taking classes with Carl Weick and you're thinking about all this stuff, and so how do you go about I don't know, designing this study?
Yeah, I mean, it was great because my doctoral program was mixed methods, so you took a lot of quantitative methods, and I'm always trying to quantify everything. And then we also took qualitative methods, and it was exciting when we did qualitative methods. It sort of opened the whole lens of like, wait, I can, I don't have to just survey people and do statistical analysis. I can talk to people. So, so that kind of opened up your whole methodological toolkit. And so, so you design obviously, as both of you design a carefully developed questionnaire that kind of links to some theoretical ideas from your lit review. And in this case, I used sense making and sense giving, which was kind of sense giving is sort of somewhat of the persuasion. How do you help people make sense of a situation? And so I used those two lenses. There was a famous paper by Denny Gioia, who's a Penn State faculty member, 1991 article on sense making and sense giving of university presidents, and I used that. It was one of my main articles I used to help as a theoretical lens. But so so you design a careful questionnaire to ask them about their experience. I mostly asked about their experience over their first year. How did you, what kind of first steps did you take? How did you go about figuring out what to do next? What figuring out the story of the organization? How do you interpret things? So I drove around, did them all in person, drove around all around the Midwest doing them in person. And they were a lot of fun to do. People were very generous with their time, over an hour at least to talk about their experience. And I did roughly kind of 6 smaller liberal arts college, 6 sort of mid-size state universities, and then 6 kind of big research universities. And that wasn't the main sort of variable that but it gave you that kind of sample of what it was like at these huge research universities versus smaller liberal arts college. But I came away with that rejecting my sort of corporate savior hypothesis.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I really kind of said colleges are in tough. Some people, they're in tough situations, and that outsider perspective really injects all this energy and new ideas and fresh thinking. And in a way, it's pretty healthy and functional. I had thought it was kind of dysfunctional because there is this sort of like, oh, a college president's tenure is about 5 years. And so my kind of cynical hypothesis was that people kind of come in, can't make any change, leave, make $1 million a year or whatever, and then leave. But I think there was some people stay longer than 5 years, and it does inject kind of this new energy, a fresh outsider. I think it as I kind of follow some scandals in the news, sometimes when people are there in a very long time and there's not outsiders coming in, that can also be pretty bad. There can be some corruption or things can go on when there isn't these outsider perspectives that come in. So I came away, kind of rejecting a bit of that corporate savior hypothesis. And there's also, a lot of other fascinating findings. There was a strong notion of really being like a corporate CEO among the presidents. That was, perhaps not surprising, but the boards of directors are usually corporate CEOs. They want a strategic plan. So a lot of people really, Jim Collins' Good to Great book was really big. So there's a lot of people that pronounce that as their sort of leadership philosophy. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that sort of drawing from these norms of kind of a corporate CEO position, always having a strategy, having a strategic plan. And so it was a lot of fun to do and make sense of and put their stories together. And another interesting finding is that one of the I use a little quote in the interviews was from Mary Sue Coleman, who had been president at University of Michigan, and she had done an interview with a friend of mine. And in the article, she says, university is like a big puzzle. It takes about 2 years to figure it all out. And so I would kind of use that as a quote and then talk to people about what they thought about that. And it was interesting how some people were like, no, it took me about 5 minutes to figure out that the problem was enrollment. That was the biggest issue. And I had a change plan right from the start, and other people said, yeah, that's, not necessarily that sounds about right, but, 2 years might be the upper end of, you have to do some sort of listening and trying to I talk about being like a anthropologist to a certain degree, like a lay ethnographer was the term in the literature and organizational culture literature. Like you're trying to understand, like an ethnographer, you're trying to, you get out of your office, you go to other people's offices, you try to pick up these implicit norms of the organization. You do a lot of listening tours. And so there's other people on the other end of the spectrum that really did those listening tours for many, many months. And so I talk about that kind of continuum of certainty. I talk about intellectual humility, kind of that, having that certainty. The problem is X, let's do it right away, versus what can be more intellectual diffidence. Like you never know enough. You're never a complete expert. There's always more you can learn. And, that trying to balance between being super certain versus intellectually diffident, that, it's going to take me 2 years to listen, or it's going to take me 5 minutes. Like that balance of being in the middle somewhere where you know enough and you're open to learn, but at the same time, you don't take too long and without any kind of direction or thought. So that was another finding that I, from the study, you can kind of see people varied on that continuum.
That's great. That kind of thing would seem to me to be important in like so many facets of life, right? Like that balance between having confidence that you could do it, but also like asking the right questions and having humility, but not taking too much time. That's like there's an art there.
Yeah.
Reminds me of,
go ahead.
It reminds me of, a book that actually we kind of read together, didn't we? Thinking Fast and Slow, right? Like learning when it is to think when we got to think fast and make decisions kind of quickly, that we do have enough information to make a decision, and when we actually need to slow it down and listen more. How have since, it's been a while now, you're since you did that, and now you're an instructor and you're working practically with all types of professionals, people like us who are out in the field, practitioners, especially even more, I guess, right, than academics. How do you think about this now? How do you think about that big takeaway of finding the sweet spot before making decisions when you're in a leadership position like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think I've added more nuance to it in terms of the sort of front stage, backstage, where I think backstage it's always helpful. Backstage and like what's going on in your thoughts in your mind.
Oh,
It's always good to be that have intellectual humility, or Adam Grant in Rethinking called it confident humility is the term he
yes.
uses.
Fantastic.
I think backstage, like that's all relatively always a good thing. The front stage, of course, I think it's probably changed too. I thought, oh, it's really good to project that confidence too, and instill that confidence in your sort of front stage. It's a balance too, but I think that would be the nuance that I've probably thought more about over time, and other writers have as well, in terms of, when you, that projection of confidence can really help people, motivate people, or have belief in the purpose and where we're going. And
Yeah.
so I think that would probably be a nuance that has been developed since.
That's great. Well, I think we're going to get into maybe close to that conversation, I think, when we start talking a little bit more about your new book.
What are you holding up, Tuli?
Yeah. No. This is Ryan's new book, which hopefully we'll have already mentioned in the introduction.
Yes.
Called, Speaking About Work, because there is a lot there about persuasion and quiet persuasion, and right, and like, how do you get people to listen to you in some way?
Yeah.
But I don't know. Before that, Alma, anything else we wanted to ask Ryan before we get to the...
Well, not about that. Kind of going back to your story, your journey, your professional journey, and everything. So there was a first book before we even get to the second book. Where does that first book come in its topic and all of that, and the link with MS?
Yeah, the first book, the Organizational Learning and Performance book, the science and practice of building a learning culture. That was when I started in MSLC. I was teaching the organizational learning core class.
Yeah.
And so that was a way to kind of synthesize, what does it mean to learn as an individual? Where is the science there? What does it mean to learn as an organization? What are our examples of organizations, and how they have learned in a way that links to performance? And so that book was also, I early on, like my first organizational behavior course, I read Peter Senge's Fifth Discipline book. So I was fascinated by it. I think in Boston, I was in some sort of a systems thinking group, organizational development group, and sort of fascinated by a fifth discipline. And so organizational learning and performance was meant to be. Now, the Senge book, it is, very, very well written, an impressive, had a tremendous impact. Humbly, I was trying to think, how it was not necessarily grounded on sort of cognitive science of learning. And so organizational learning performance was meant to kind of try to link a little bit better the psychology of learning with the organizational learning space. For example, like in the organizational learning space, they sort of talk about double loop learning all the time, like Chris Ardress, and people love the term. And
what does it mean?
It really kind of, it's not just a single loop, but a double loop is to sort of challenge your assumptions, deeper assumptions. But it always kind of bothered me because, in cognitive science, like if I talk to a cognitive scientist who studies learning for a living, and I said, "Oh, double loop learning," they would have no idea what I was talking about. And
really?
So, yeah, they would be like, "Double loop learning, what is that?" Like, that's not something we've ever studied. So it was trying to ground organizational learning in the science of learning in a stronger way, and so that was my bringing in more. It's why I call it the science and practice of building a learning organization. Building a learning culture was trying to bring some of the science into organizational learning, try to bring it into the field a bit more explicitly, because that had been the big critique of Senge and Chris Ardress to a certain degree, is sort of that there was a sort of mysticism about being a learning organization, this kind of ideal, and you never quite live up to that. And so then it kind of crashes as a fad. And so I was trying to kind of ground it a little more precisely in sort of the scientific literature, along with, what I think are compelling examples of organizations that help exemplify a lot of the principles and ideas. So
in the beginning of that book, of your first book, learning organization book, I think that you also gave the example, or at least grounded some of it in this dichotomy between this idea of like exploring in organizations and exploiting in organizations. So whereas we're mostly exploiting our capacities, right? If we're an organization that makes toilet paper, or if we're a company that makes toilet paper, we mostly focus on making great toilet paper and, you know, in our system and all that. But whereas I think long-lasting organizations, or organizations that are really going to be in it for the long haul, also need to explore the opportunities. So would it be fair to say that when you talk about organizational learning and a learning organization, we're talking especially about that kind of exploration component that allows organizations to be successful in the long run?
It is, yeah. I mean, that was, you know, that language and that exploration exploitation has a long history from, you know, both in computer science and then in strategy. And part of the argument there is in that first chapter is that balance between exploration and exploitation that, you know, it is, again, that the organizational learning could be critiqued as sort of like, okay, we should all be like we're in a doctoral seminar in organizations in this exploration of ideas. And obviously that's not practical. And so it's like, well, instead of advocating for that in an impractical, idealistic way, you might say, well, instead of like this, you know, what is called a competency trap, when we're in this exploitation cycle of doing the same things over cheaper, faster, more reliably, and just making small refinements and sort of getting in that cycle, and then never having that exploration, whether it's 10% of your time, 5% of the time, you know, that would obviously vary, but that organizational learning is trying to, you know, help avoid those, what are called, you know, those competency traps where you get stuck in, I call it typhoon zone from Gary Ridge at WD-40, where you're just kind of, which they, you know, is a common trap in organizations where you get really good, you make small refinements, and then there's a large environmental shock, or over time, you just become, you know, less able to adapt because you don't have that some kind of innovation or new ideas. So
yeah. Can you actually tell our listeners maybe quickly about that WD-40 example, or another one? Because it's such a great example. I mean, people should go out and buy the book, but you know, this is a little teaser.
Yeah. No, I love, Gary Ridge at WD-40. I mean, it's a product, I think, you know, in brand surveys, it's like number 3 behind like Coca-Cola. They had like 94%, 95% of households had a can of WD-40. This is in the late 1990s. And you know, they had started in about, so WD-40 stands for water displacement. And on the 40th try, the inventor in the 1950s came up with this formula for it. And
I love how in the book you described that the formula lives in a vault in like San Diego, a bank in San Diego or somewhere.
It's in a bank in San Diego, and it's in like pencil. The formula is written in pencil, similar to like Coca-Cola. But they didn't, like a patent, I think it would expire after 17 years, and so that everybody would freely know what that is, could use it. So they never did that, so they just kept it secret. But in the 1990s, other companies were getting close with re-engineering. 3M had something very similar. And so they had been what Gary Ridge talks about being a brand fortress. They were just the one can. We have the one can, we do this great.
Yeah.
And then, you know, again, that's the exploitation end of things. We've got this can, we're doing great. We're 94%, 95% there, people have it. And then you have this external shock. And so he really worked to create a learning culture at WD-40 to say, okay, what's the new way, like this exploration end of things, and you know, how can we you know, what kind of new things can we build or buy, or what can we learn? And so he was also a student in an organizational learning master's program too, so he was using kind of all these organizational learning frameworks and ideas to help also refresh the strategy and lead to new renewal. And so and they've done really well. I mean, they've got now, you know, all these different related products, and it's a very high engagement culture. And so it's a case of kind of using those learning culture to really kind of refresh, renew, and as a way to, again, get out of that competency trap or the exploitation trap of things. So.
So if I remember correctly, another example in that previous book was about a company called Bridgewater. And is it true to say that the Bridgewater example is also one of the reasons you ended up writing this new book?
Yeah, it was partly an inspiration, because they did talk at Bridgewater. They talk a lot about being an independent thinker, and so that was part of the genesis. What does that mean to be an independent thinker? And that's particularly true in their environment in investing. You sort of need an independent perspective that's counter to the market. But when you're counter to what most people think, what the consensus is, you can be wrong a lot of the time as well. Yeah. So it's kind of that. So I was fascinated by that process of independent thinking. Yeah. What does it mean to be an independent thinker? And there was a lot of other, you would hear the term a lot. Morty Shapiro, the president of the time at Northwestern, had a big talk about being an independent thinker to undergraduates here. So that was sort of always been an ethos. So that was sort of the fascination there, the genesis of the book.
Can you say a little bit more about, because I do recall the Bridgewater, right? But for example, but for our listeners, this is a controversial culture, right?
What's controversial about it? It's the best place on earth, the happiest place on earth. Some kids want to go to Disneyland. I want to go to Bridgewater. Sounds amazing.
So tell us why Tuli thinks it's better than Disneyland. Could you go through what are the big principles and the practices that they have that make them a pretty unique case? I think still to this day they're pretty unique, right?
Yeah, I mean they sort of espouse this sort of radical truth and radical transparency.
Yeah, are they radical candor people? Is that no? Radical candor is from someone else, right?
Yeah, radical candor is from another book, but it's the same basic idea.
Okay,
that you just use transparency rather than candor.
Okay.
The candor is a good word to describe it. It does, there are good forms and bad forms of it. I think the best forms of it are that you're really explaining your reasoning, and you're like, why do you think if we do X, Y will happen? Explain your full transparency of your reasoning and why you think it's going to happen. In a way that helps break down authority. We're not going to just accept it because the senior vice president says we're doing X. But we're going to really challenge those ideas and say, we think, is that really correct? Are your assumptions correct? If we do X, it's going to lead to Y. What's your evidence? What's the chain of reasoning? And being really transparent about that. Obviously, there's bad forms, in terms of people just, saying whatever is on their mind at all times. And it's not really that per se, but they, it's a chapter in the organizational learning and performance book that the Bridgewater, their culture, and they have, Ray Dalio's, obviously his book came out in his principles book a few years ago, and he's, had TED Talks. People are fairly familiar with his work, but it's a very unique culture. It was also one that really was like Chris Ardress. So there was really two big figures in organizational learning, like Peter Senge and Chris Ardress. And so much of what Chris Ardress at Harvard wrote about in the 1970s, it all sort of resonated with what they were doing at Bridgewater. They didn't obviously do that, but Chris Ardress would talk about the left-hand column technique, where you write about what's said and then what's not said. And then organizational learning happens when the stuff in the left-hand column, what's not said, is said. The elephants in the room or something like that. And so there was so much of that was sort of like present at Bridgewater that it looked like, a good example of that. But obviously it can be taken too far, not live up to that ideal and take lots of negative forms. So it, certainly can not work. But I think there's at least that saying more what's left unsaid, and that pursuit of truth, at least. Now, truth is kind of a battered term, and but at least kind of drilling down a little bit deeper on our assumptions and what we think is going to work, and the willingness to kind of question those. So so I kind of use it as a model of those things in our kind of moderate ways to overcome a lot of the conformity in organizations.
So is this new book speaking up at work in a way an attempt to empower people to kind of bring some of that independent thinking, I guess, no matter where they work? Not, you don't have to be a Bridgewater employee to be an independent thinker at work. Is that
yeah, that would be my hope. I mean, that's my aspiration with it, that if you have good ideas and they're against the norms, or you want to challenge the consensus, or challenge the senior leadership's view on something, or that it provides stories and some tactics that can help you with that experience, and a way to do it more smartly than.
So let's if it's okay, let's start. There's the book opens with this great story. The guy's name, I think, is Larry Bouts. I don't know if if I'm pronouncing it
correct. Yeah.
So he's this Navy officer who in the early 1980s, he had recently completed an MBA, and he becomes a leader of a business division or a business planning unit at PepsiCo. And he comes up with I think what a brilliant idea, and that is we should take water, which I guess until then people were either getting from
tap,
the tap, or I mean before that from a well, and then the tap, of course. And he's like, no, we got to put this stuff in bottles. So Ryan, I'm wondering if you could describe to us what happened when he brings this suggestion, and how that all played out.
Yeah, so this is in the early 80s, and they were kind of seeing that trend that bottled water might be a real thing, and he got brought it up. He was the head of strategic planning or strategic division, and got really shot down. That's the dumbest idea we've ever heard. Who's going to pay for water? It's free from the tap. You could see that. I mean, that makes sense. Like, why would you pay for?
We are kind of dumb.
Yeah.
Pay for water now.
And it is fascinating because we never know if we're right for sure, but obviously he was proven right by time, and that was a certain fascinating. People are sort of at the cusp or early edge of things, and seeing something and saying, that willingness to say, I think this is a big issue. I think this is a big issue, or I think this is a big trend, or we ought to go in this direction. I think everybody's wrong. And he was shot down, and sort of thought he would lose his job. He had other options, and had some, so it wasn't like, so he had some extra security to be able to speak up about innovative things. But almost any innovative idea, in a lot of ways, at its early inception, you could say, that a lot of things initially sound like it's silly or dumb, or you could easily critique them or find reasons why they're not going to be true, or that's not right. The consensus says X, and is the consensus right? And so there, there are lots of stories, and the other story in the book. One of the also inspirations of the book was I open up the second chapter talking about Michael Burry, the investor. If people have seen The Investor, and he was
the Big Short,
a Big Short fame, and Michael Lewis chronicled him. It's a little bit different because it's out of an organizational context per se, but it's a great example of independent thinking in a way that the consensus was that housing prices always rise, and if you pull together mortgage-backed securities, your risk is zero, very, very small. And for him to see something that few other people saw, other people did, he said, other people did, but he put a hundreds of $1 million bet on it.
Yeah.
And it was trying to understand that, that process of critically scrutinizing ideas. I talk about it. It's a, critical thinking is both to have the generation of ideas, but then there's the effective selection of those ideas. And, you can come up with lots of ideas, and how do you, and that can be a group process of effective selection of those ideas, and which ones are the strongest ones that survive. That can also be the conformity pressure that, well, no, it's a dumb idea. Everybody thinks this, it's true. But how do you persist on, even if, the whole everybody's saying, and the consensus is is one way. How do you continue on? And so that's part of the fascination, what I was fascinated with in the book, and hearing stories from people that had those experiences.
Yeah. How did you prepare for this book? So I know we've already gotten into content a bit, but if you could go back a little bit, what did the preparation, like how'd you go about getting ready for this?
It's just a slow process. You just sort of slowly, like during breaks in the academic calendar here or there, and you set up interviews with people and try to explore their stories, and then
I'm pausing. I'm laughing, Ryan, not at you, but I'm laughing at how casually you're just like, oh, it's just a thing you do, and you just get little breaks in your calendar and you talk to people. You make when I think of like the process of writing a book, I'm like, wow, what a rock star. That's discipline. That's so many moving pieces. It's a lot of real deep thinking, and then decision making, and then synthesizing, and then everything.
Yeah.
And
I think, if you do it all once, if some people, I think, if you some people that maybe have like a deadline, like, oh, I'm just gonna do it, I've got 6 months or something. That's not usually like how I sort of just work in small bits over time.
Yeah.
And it kind of slowly builds. You have a little section here and a little section there, and it's one of I always think about Denny Joy, who I mentioned, Penn State, and he had some article that I read in my doctoral training about scholarship and doing scholarly work and stuff, and he mentioned sort of being like, some people are painters and they love, like, every day you want to paint a little bit, or when you have some free time you like to paint. And like his was like working on manuscripts, a little bit of time here or there you work on a manuscript. It's sort of the same. I've always thought about that quote, and just if you kind of enjoy the process of synthesizing ideas and a certain way to have an impact on individuals like yourself, humbly, in terms of in courses, trying to learn the material and these ideas better so that I can help individuals like yourself, or any master students, and then master students kind of writ large, and others who are in similar situations.
So how many people did you talk to in preparing for this book? How many interviews?
I did a little over 50 interviews with people, and then I don't know exactly how many used, maybe 20 of those stories help frame different parts of the different chapters. So I have those, and then there's a few famous examples that also help illustrate things. So like Sharon Watkins at Enron has lots of information, interviews out there, and so I was interested in her experience and what it can teach us.
Can you tell that story? Can you tell that story of Sharon Watkins at Enron?
Yeah, that's she was obviously made it to a whistleblower, to Time Person of the Year, but she it was a fascinating thing. I mean, she had been a certified accountant, but then had shifted a division, and then was in charge of a new section at Enron, and then just started asking questions. And I really interested. I think experience we would all have at certain times. She would be sort of spoken down to, like she was sort of dumb, like, don't you get it? We're just putting it in that other company, that's all. And
I think they call that gaslighting.
Yeah. And just say, like, it doesn't get that creative. Like, she's been in accounting for a while, it doesn't get that creative. And so being willing to kind of question, it didn't make sense to her, back to kind of sense making a bit, but it didn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me, this accounting practice here. And she was a bit an outsider, a bit too. She was not in the boys club at Enron, and was willing to kind of question that, and also willing to question. I have a section there about willing to potentially look stupid. I mean, you have to say, like, this doesn't make sense to me. I mean, am I not seeing it right? Like, you could be actually not be seeing it right in many situations, or it could unravel this whole thing. And so that was the case for her, and it was a difficult road for her. And there's a few whistleblowers in the book, but the book was not about it's not about whistleblowing per se. I think it's just their stories are illustrative, but they're also at least on the everyday form, there are a bit rare. They're about, uncovering this kind of rare fraud that hopefully few of us will
Have to
come
live.
across. So I do have whistleblowing does really exemplify independent thinking in its extreme form. But most of us are kind of questioning maybe a strategy that doesn't make sense, but not necessarily fraud.
Yeah.
That is fraud or blatant legal behavior. So her story is in chapter 2 as well.
Yeah. I wonder, Ryan, if you might have an example from your own life of when you've been an independent thinker or a lone voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one that in a funny way, similar to the bottled water, like when I was at Denison too, and it's not, we were a organizational culture firm, and this is like 2006, 2007.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were calling do you do engagement surveys? And we're like, no, we don't do engagement surveys, we do culture. And so it was similar, like an emerging trend. And I do remember advocating, could we do an engagement module or engagement survey of some sort? And that, that was not the model, Denison model been developed through 5 years of research. And it was like, well, you can't just create a new engagement model. That's going to take the assumption that it would take too long. Mm-hmm. And so I was advocating for that when it seemed pretty unpopular. It seemed like it seems silly in retrospect. It's like bottled water, engagement, we're in 2023, everybody does an engagement survey. But at that time, that was sort of a relatively new thing. Wow. And so
when did they come around? When did they actually, were you there?
We did end up working, when I was there, we did end up working on an engagement module that helped capture some of the things that the 60 item model didn't capture. And so I worked with a team of IO psychologists there to kind of to help build, that market niche, what was a real trend towards engagement surveys at the time. So it's, somewhat similar to other stories in the book, but I can't claim.
Yeah. Can I just say, Alma, that Larry character in the book at PepsiCo also tried making the same suggestion about coffee, and in a response that was highly offensive to both
I
Alma
was very
and
angry.
me. He goes, "Coffee is a dead duck," I think is the quote.
Yes.
Nobody drinks coffee.
No one drinks coffee.
Yeah, coffee is on its way out.
It's on its way out or whatever. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So my hope is, a lot of us might be in a similar situation, or that we're we ought to do X, Y, or Z, and innovative idea, and you'll get shot down.
Yeah. It
could be that you're wrong, but it could be that you're right. And then it's whether you continue on and persist.
So it's one thing if you're in charge, but it's another thing for many of us who maybe don't have absolute authority in companies. So in chapter 3 especially, you give some really good suggestions of how to persuade without authority, right? So one suggestion you have is about asking questions as opposed to being very direct. Can you share maybe a couple of other ideas of how people could try to be a little bit more persuasive about ideas?
Yeah, I think a couple of the other common ones that came up through a few of the interviews. Social proof is a common one. Now it's almost antithetical to independent thinking, but it's to say that in another organization, some people that had a new idea, we ought to try. In the book, I talk about doing an appreciative inquiry summit, where you kind of look at the positive, what's working as opposed to what's not working. And that was a kind of a radical suggestion in this manufacturing context. He was an independent thinker in that context. People were like, what is that? Why would we do that? But the big learning there is to say, here are some other similar organizations to us that have done that. And that's sort of that social proof, and that a lot of people kind of mention similar things. When you're advocating that innovative idea, can you provide some social proof of where it's working by other individuals or other organizations that are similar? That's one. I think obviously building your credibility is a key one. It's sort of end that, but it's a key one that if you can, maybe it's not the right time to advocate for X, Y, Z, but if you can build your credibility, then you have to wait a bit, and you become much more persuasive, and if you can, and another one obviously is that's very persuasive is to create some inconsistency between here's what we're advocating for, here's what we're currently doing, and there's this inconsistency there. And our organizational values are to say X, and we're doing Y. And so that creating that inconsistency there is a key one. So if you can link it to your organizational values or stated organizational values is another one. But yeah, there's a lot. I open up the persuasiveness chapter, but with emotional regulation being a key one, like generally, trying to keep your cool in a certain way when advocating an independent point of view. In what's called is if you move over to sort of deviant anger or deviant upset, where then your behavior becomes the focus rather than the idea itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like you want it to be on the idea itself, not that kind of lost your cool. And then you sort of get discredited. So that's another kind of key one that people mentioned. And as Adam Grett mentioned, one of his article that helps frame that is rock the boat but keep it steady. Mm-hmm. In a way, like speak up but have that emotional regulation to keep the focus on the idea itself and not your necessarily advocacy of it. So
you actually, Ryan, you shared that article with me because you were my capstone advisor, and mm-hmm. you shared that article with me as an example of like how to set up a study, because okay. So that's when I read that article, and now I know okay. Now I know another reason, or I'm sure you would have read it anyway, but I guess
mm-hmm. yeah.
I think, Ryan, this makes me think a lot about what's happening currently in organizations, like just with everything that's going on in the economy, and maybe more here in the US and in Europe, right? With big companies, still lots of layoffs going on. Still since 2020, at least in the US, kind of equity and racial mm-hmm. reckoning going on. That's also, of course, mm-hmm. Culture wars, everything that's going on. And I think specifically about people in our space, right? And of course, this is those of us who are passionate about people challenges at work mm-hmm. and how change is brought about and all of that. And I know you wrote the book for a more general audience, not just people in the learning and org change space. But my first thought is like, oh, wow, I think especially right now, those of us who want to bring about meaningful change or not bring about the change, who want to respond and lead organizations and people in organizations through change, whether they like it or not, but in a way that is empathic, a way that does take into consideration the full human and all of the social reality, that being an independent thinker is not just like a nice to have. I think and especially MSLOC type of people, right? It's more than nice to have. I think it's quite necessary to mm-hmm. learn. What do you or I don't know. That's kind of my opinion from what I've read of the book and what I understand from you. But where do you stand on that? Like, where does our field, those of us working in people, talent, change, etc., does our field need some solid independent thinkers? Yes, no, why not?
Yeah, I mean, I do tell a story in chapter 4.
Okay, haven't read that one. Sorry.
No, it's
full disclosure.
It is thinking about. It is a story of a woman who's brought in to be the organizational change team member in a smaller unit, and it was like their belief in change was like a 0 or 1, or this change management stuff was not needed, mm-hmm. and so it took her about 2 to 3 years, where then she really kind of converted everybody to her understanding of the need for change management, effective change management. She would talk about the technology adoption curve, understanding end users, doing ethnographic interviews to understand users' needs. And she got them to like a 10 on a 10 scale in their belief in change, largely because they would try to implement stuff and not do any change management tactics, right. And then it would fail.
Yeah.
And so she was always there constantly advocating for for these change management tactics. And then they finally came around. So she was an independent thinker about the idea of change management
Right.
in her team. And so, I think it's, again, it wasn't like a one conversation she had to, turn everybody around in that amount of time. But I think people kind of learned from their experiences of trying to implement new products, new changes, and it's just falling flat. And then everything she was advocating for, they started to see the value of that. And so, it's a long process, like a lot of things are. But, I think one of the major messages of the book is also to speak up as a way to induce a conversation.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to make any convert right away. Because, oh yeah, okay, we believe, you got it. But you induce a conversation in a sort of a non-threatening way. You just kind of say, well, maybe we should think about the change adoption curve, or doing interviews with end users, just trying to induce a conversation, and it can kind of slowly change minds over time. So that was one of the key things I learned from people's stories and telling me that.
What if I played devil's advocate for a second, and I was an organizational leader, and I said, I don't want my people speaking up. Creates too much of a headache. I just want them to do what I do.
It's not good for capitalism. No. We got to produce and do things.
I don't know what's the response to that dark impulse inside.
Yeah, I think that's the bit. Chapter 5, I talk about the kind of autocratic impulse where we might be a kind of a good-natured autocrat. We'll just start issuing orders. It's more efficient. No question, obviously. And there are some situations where that's called for. Maybe you have good expertise as a leader. You've seen this 100 times, and you can make a call. And it's extreme. Constantly advocating for speaking up may lead to this real fractious, politicized environment. But I think the hazard is, especially in the deliberation phase of things, is you're going to get the best ideas. And if you have more voices at that time in the deliberation, you think about a lot of decisions, you can think about the deliberation phase versus implementation phase. Yeah, it's not in the implementation phase. You want to give ideas a chance. You want to keep saying, I don't think we should do this. We should, it's not going to work, or we should do something different. If you have a deliberation phase, you're going to have better decisions if you get all the everybody's different perspectives and piece of the puzzle, and you're not going to see the whole thing just as an individual, but collectively you'll make a much better decision. Or one person will have to make the decision, but they'll be more informed in doing so. But yeah, it takes a certain degree of humility for a leader. Again, it's much easier to issue orders. And I sort of talk about two different, alignment is a common buzzword. In chapter 5, I talk about alignment built on independent thinking versus alignment built on conformity. And I have a sort of image to illustrate that. But like, if you want just everybody kind of towing the line, being a yes man or yes person, and just and then just not speaking up, versus having alignment built on. There you go. Yeah.
There's people being Tuli holds up the image.
I know, people being able to speak up and then build alignment on top of that. And I use a quote from Nadella at Microsoft, who talks about that, building alignment on top of a foundation of independent thinking where people have a chance to share their viewpoints on things, which also is, there's a certain procedural justice. You felt like the decision-making process was fair and just, even if you don't get your way. Tuli, I know procedural justice well, and if you're Alma as well.
Yeah.
Even if you don't necessarily get your way, there's a value expressive worth of sharing. I think this strategy we should go in this direction with this strategy. I think we should do this. And if I don't get my way, I don't get my way, or I don't persuade people. But if I never have a chance to do that, then I'm just kind of forced to take a position or do something that can lead to a certain amount of resentment and suboptimal decisions.
I can't help but think about, as you talk through these different examples of of independent thinkers. And I will definitely be looking into the case study of chapter 4, because that sounds fascinating. And I think that we're definitely at a time where we need, like, where it's just it's easy for big companies, and many of them are doing it, are thinking more about efficiency and bottom line than human beings. And even if they are, they're having a hard time. Many companies are really struggling to invest in even the processes of helping people through change, right? As we see companies going, even I just found out this morning, I did not know this, and I was really surprised. Google is actually calling people back to the, right? Like I don't know that I doubt it's every unit, but perhaps some units and teams are actually mandatory coming back into the office.
Every day? Or
Yeah.
some days every day?
Yeah, or like 3, but like more rigid. You got to come in 3 times. You got to come in 4 times. Some teams are full time on site, and it's just anyways. There are a lot.
We could have that discussion. I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but okay, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, well. Though I think the issue is they're not Google specifically, because I haven't read up enough on that case. But what we are seeing is a lot of organizations struggling to adapt and work under kind of new conditions, new expectations. And it's not just post-COVID, it's all, or post-pandemic, but it's also Gen Z coming into the workforce and coming back to the office and not knowing what that is like. And there's just a myriad, and then the economy. And so there's a myriad of challenges that are inherently related to people and how people experience or want to participate in change, like procedural justice, right? If you're getting mandatorily called back into the office, you're probably not participating in the decision. So when you think of independent thinker and how important they are, also think of this other concept that I associate you with, Ryan, which is learning orientation. Because the first time that I got to hang out with you via Zoom, spent a lot of time, not just me and you, I mean, like the whole group, right? We spent a lot of time talking about juxtaposing a learning orientation versus a performance orientation. And so first of all, I'd love if you could give us your definition of what those are. And then would you say that an independent thinker, like what are the connections that you see between an independent thinker and having a learning orientation?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think if you have the terms, I would say a learning orientation comes out of learning sciences and studies of students. It's taking an orientation to any situation to what can I learn? Can I ask questions to explore, to understand? Performance orientation, you're more concerned about your self-presentation. How can I look smart, look like I have the answer? And it's more concerned with those self-presentation motives.
And results, right? And that people see the results. Is that also true in performance?
Potentially, yeah. I think, potentially, or you're more concerned with that outcome, rather than the process. I mean, I would think the independent thinkers obviously would be more, they would be more, have more of a learning orientation or a curiosity. I do talk about that in chapter 2, about that curiosity or the slow hunches, or things don't make sense, or I'm willing to ask. It's similar to, as we mentioned, Sharon Watkins. I'm willing to ask, this doesn't make sense. Can you explain this to me? It's having that humility or courage too, to ask the question. Can you explain this strategy? Can you explain this? And in a way that in a performance orientation, you're not going to ask that, because it would assumes that I don't know the answer already, so I'm not going to ask the question. So if Sharon Watkins took a performance orientation, she wouldn't have said, this doesn't make sense to me here. So there would be the connection there. I think that would be the strongest connection. I think as you think about curiosity, following slow hunches, a willingness to ask questions, there'd be a strong linkage there in terms of developing that, as you think about developing that independent point of view through asking.
Amazing. I think I think we're out of time, or nearly out of time. And so the book is Speaking Up at Work and Leading Change as an Independent Thinker. We could link to it, or you can buy it wherever good books are sold, I hope.
Yeah.
And, I guess as the final question, or one of the final questions that we that I'll combine kind of two questions, and part one would be just what would be the thing, like the one thing that you hope that people get out of reading this? Yeah, that's really the question, and then Alma, you could go with the final question.
I would, I think it takes some comfort and insight and courage from hearing other people's stories, so that if you're in a similar situation in the future, you can think back, oh, I remember the story from the book of that person. And it gives you some extra courage to speak up about a new independent, innovative idea. So that would be my one hope, my one aspiration.
Oh, so I have the final question?
If you want it. You don't have to. I could, or we could end it here.
Final question.
We could end it here.
No, I don't have a final question.
A final question we like to ask people is like, what is because the podcast is called Beautiful Questions, and we like to ask people, what else have they been curious about, or what questions have they been asking lately? It could be about anything. It could have to do with what we've been talking about. It could have to do with anything, really.
Yeah.
That's a great question. Any question that I'm currently pondering, or
anything you've been curious about, really just anything.
Yeah, there's so many. I would say, well, right now I'm looking at awe as an emotion and curiosity, reading Dacher Keltner's great book on awe,
really,
the psychology of awe. So I think that is a current is I'm thinking about that relation to curiosity, sort of the awe, which is kind of this experience of mystery and vastness. And he talks about a lot of different ways that it's sparked through nature, through moral beauty, through lots of ways. So I think that's a current thing I'm thinking about and reading and trying to understand. So that, there isn't a one specific question, but how that might help drive learning, or what could that experience of awe, and maybe an educational context too, as well, things that you're awed by, that some of the stories in the book are awe-inspiring for me, the people that do these things and persist, and that sort of as an emotion that kind of sparks maybe further learning. Or so I think that's probably what
I love that.
Currently thinking about. Yeah, I
love that. Alma, I feel like we could ask people, like, when's the last time you felt awe? I know that's a great question. I'm trying to think about that myself.
That's incredible. Wow. I did not expect that answer, Ryan. I was like,
oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, you hadn't told us what you're reading, what you're curious.
Yeah.
And we hadn't asked. So I'm really glad you asked, Tuli.
That's great. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for doing this. This is, as always,
thank you.
I mean, every conversation I have with you, I feel like I emerge in awe. And certainly more informed than I was before it. So thank you for being such a great teacher and mentor, and thank you so much for coming on our podcast and
thank you.
And talking to us about your life, your work, this new awesome book that I hope everyone buys and reads.
Awesome. There's the word. Awesome.
Yeah, and buy it for your friends.
Yes.
Give it out to your colleagues. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, definitely.